This is a how-to guide on how to make a few frozen desserts, including a granita, a sorbet, and an ice cream. This isn't meant to be exhaustive in any way whatsoever. There are a few different ways of making all these different desserts. This is just how I like to make them for myself. And so the first thing that I decide for myself is, what am I in the mood for? Is it summer, spring, is it hot, and I'm looking for something cold, refreshing, fruity, and fresh, like a sorbet or granita with heaps and heaps of acid in there? Or is it winter, or maybe I'm feeling a little bit bluesy and sad and I'm looking for comfort? So if it's comfort, I want spices, I want warmth, I want smokiness, I want richness, I want texture, and I want lots of fillings and toppings on the inside, biscuits, waffle cones, that kind of thing. Or I'm looking to maybe making something that is dairy free, and in that context, I look to coconut milk and cream. But importantly here is, I don't use coconut milk and cream as a substitute for dairy. I come up with conceptual dishes that make sense paired with coconut, or for a flavor that's so empowered, so overpowering, it completely silences the coconut flavor in its entirety. So one-to-one substitutions from dairy to coconut don't always work. Make sure it makes sense as a dish in your context. We are going to be making a granita, a sorbet, and an ice cream. So the first thing we're going to focus on is the granita and the sorbet, since they have the same sort of foundation of flavors and approaches. And we're going to be using hibiscus as our ingredient of choice. And this is some hibiscus flowers or calyxes that I got from a friend who was coming from Kenya. And most people think of this when they think of hibiscus. And it's important to note that many parts of the world have native hibiscus species, and for the most part the world is drinking the West African hibiscus calyxes. So the calyx is a formation around the flower, which is like a combination of the sepals instead of the petals. So of course we all call it hibiscus flowers, but just an important distinction to be aware of. But I don't really care what you use. We all know what we're talking about when we say hibiscus tea and hibiscus flower. The particular combination of flavors I'm looking to use in this context is actually inspired by a drink called zobo, bisap, sobolo, agua de Jamaica, sorro, however you know it, right? So at its base is hibiscus flowers, combine some spices or some fruit, additional seasoning essentially. And in my case, I'm starting off with a pineapple and some ginger, and I'm just gonna wash those nicely in some soapy water or some vinegar, however you like, because I'm keeping the skins on. It's not particularly important to me that I peel it, because I'm not gonna blend it throughout my sorbet or my granita. So combine those two together, and then I'm gonna add some spices. In my case, I want nutmeg, star anise, cloves, alligator pepper, and some bird's eye chili as well. If you want more intense flavor spices, throw them in. And if you want something a bit more subtle, you can omit the spices entirely or use less quantities. For me, in about 4 liters of liquid, I want to put in about a teaspoon of really bold things like alligator pepper or bird's eye chili, and about a tablespoon of the more subtle spices like our cinnamon, our nutmeg. After our spices go in, then we're going to put in our star of the show, which is our hibiscus flowers, and I'm going to add about 2 cups of hibiscus for every 4 liters of liquid. And it's important here to decide for yourself, do I want something a lot more tart, hence 2 cups, or I want something a bit more subtle, of which 1 cup will do plenty. We're going to take everything and then put it in a pot with our 4 liters of water, and then we're going to bring that up to a boil. And once it's at boil, we're going to let it simmer for about 30 minutes or so to extract as much flavor possible from our raw ingredients. And your house, your kitchen, your space should smell amazing at this point, because all the spices and aromatics are infusing into the air, into your fabric, into your very being, into your very essence. After 30 minutes of a simmer, remove from the heat and let it cool down for a little bit. So at this point, I'm going to strain the solids separate from the liquids, and this is so that I can do the next part for the granita. We're going to return to our solids, and these solids are going to be critical for us to make our granita. And what I'm trying to do here is extract any remaining flavor from these solids to extend their value, to extend their purpose, to extend the way we can use them. In the same way, if you take your veggie waste or undesirable veggies and you put them in a base with water and some spices, you can make yourself a broth. What we're going to do, we're going to take about 1/3 of a finer volume to be the solid material. 1/3 of that into a container, then you put in the remainder of that volume as water. So if I want to make a liter of granita, I'm taking 1/3 of that to be the solids, then I'll fill it up to 1 liter with water, sprinkle in some yeast, then we let it ferment over a few days. Critical note here is there should be very little sugar left over, so there's no real risk of you making a very boozy concoction. If you want to make a boozy concoction, add more sugar. keeping in mind that alcohol may affect how it freezes later on. What this 2-day fermentation allows for is, number one, extraction of any residual flavor, but number two, development of new flavors through the fermentation. So this would be a more subtle kind of flavor compared to the main tea extract we've already done, but it will still be sophisticated enough, light enough, refreshing enough that you can enjoy this as a palate cleanser, or indeed with some gin, with some soda water as a cocktail, or on its own as a granita. So after the 2-day fermentation, what we're gonna do now, we're gonna strain it again, and this time we're gonna chuck the solids away for good. The first thing to do here is measure how much of the liquid do we have left over. And I always round it up to the next 1 liter volume with some water. So I want to add about 16% of my final mass to be brown sugar. Brown sugar's got its own little flavor in comparison to caster sugar or like white table sugar. Right? And the sugar is going to help with flavor and sweetness, but also with texture. And if you overdo the sugar, it's going to be an unbearable dessert. If you underdo it, it's going to be very icy. So what's critical here is about 16% final weight to be sugar. And then I'm going to add half a teaspoon of salt for seasoning. And if I need it, I'll add about a teaspoon of some lemon juice or some grapefruit juice, just for some acid to cut through that sweetness a little bit more. So beyond just adding flavor to your frozen dessert, sugar also acts as an antifreeze. And how it does that is by interacting with the water molecules and limiting the formation of ice crystals, or limiting the size of the ice crystal formation. And this leads to a product that has a smoother, creamier texture. If you put too little sugar in your frozen dessert, you're gonna get something that's really, really icy with big chunks of ice. But consequently, if you put too much sugar, you're gonna end up with something that's not able to freeze at all. So if you think about like freezing a beer at 5% alcohol versus freezing vodka at 40% alcohol, the vodka won't necessarily freeze, the beer will. Sugar has a similar function in the context of making frozen desserts. So the next step now is to get our sugar dissolved in our liquid base. You can do this in a few different ways. Method number one is take some of your liquid, maybe about a third of it, and warm it up, and then put your sugar into that, stir it, and then dissolve it through, and then put it back into the main bulk of the liquid. The risk here is if you're working with a very subtle flavor, the heat can potentially destroy that flavor. So keep an eye out for what kind of flavor you're playing with and if it's heat stable or not. Option number two, which I prefer myself personally, is to use a blender. If you have access to a blender, your liquid and your sugar in the blender, let it run for 30 seconds to a minute or so, and that's enough time for the sugar to be totally dissolved throughout the liquid. And this saves us from having to use too much heat in our cooking process. Once the sugar is dissolved, we can then pop our mix into our ice cream container, pop that in the freezer, and let it freeze for about 5 to 8 hours or so, checking on it every so often. What you want to come back to is a barely frozen texture. And if you have a blender, then you just chop it up at that point, put in your blender again, blend it again, and this will crush the ice into something with smaller crystals and a little bit smoother on the tongue. If you don't have a blender, that's still fine. Just grab a fork or a tablespoon or an ice cream scoop and just scrape at the top of the ice, and you keep doing that until you get to the very bottom of the ice. And what you should end up with is a nice, fluffy, airy, but still icy texture. Imagine like the snow that you get inside your freezer. You know, when you're using a cup as a kid to scrape that snow out, we're looking for a similar kind of texture in our final granita. And put that back in your ice cream container, shove it back in the freezer, and let it firm up for a few more hours. And what then this will give you is your final product, that's a granita. The difference between sorbet and granita is not churned, while sorbet is churned, and you're gonna get a very, very different texture feel. Sorbet is gonna feel smoother, creamier, and depending on how you make it, velvety and luscious as well. So now we finally return to our sobolo or zobo extract, and this is going to be the focus for our sorbet. So you can take your sobolo tea and immediately add your sugar while it's too warm. Again, 16 point something percent. There's pineapple in there, so maybe 15-14% just to counter the sweetness of the pineapple as well. At this point, things are pretty straightforward. You get your churner, you shove your sorbet into your churn, let it churn, and then enjoy that. Or in my case, I like to work with dry ice because it controls the texture and it's also cheaper than trying to buy a commercial churning machine. The addition of our dry ice allows for our liquid base to go from liquid to solid in a very, very short amount of time. And what that helps is that it limits the formation of ice crystals, which is going to give us a smooth, creamy sorbet. And importantly, it's far, far quicker than using a churner. This will take about 5 minutes to churn, as opposed to a churner, which can take between 30 to 2 hours, depending on your budget. Right, I want to touch a little bit on how we get smooth texture in our frozen dessert. Top of that is we can use churning. So the churning allows for a dessert to freeze, and we're mechanically crushing the ice crystals as they are forming. and making them smaller and smoother, and that leads to a smooth, creamy texture. That's one way of introducing smoothness into our frozen dessert base. The other way, again, is sugar or alcohol that act as antifreeze and limit the formation of ice. Churning plus sugar and or alcohol is going to lead to a creamier texture. We can also affect our texture by adding thickening agents such as xanthan gum, agar, gelatin, and they also are acting as interference for ice, right? The enemy of all progress in this context is ice. If you can figure out what thing you can add to your context to limit ice formation, you're going to get a better texture of product. And finally, you can also add a lot more fruit to your sorbet or to your ice cream, and fruits that are high in pectin or high in sugars will also add creaminess to the texture and prevent ice formation as well. If you notice, something like lemon sorbet tends to be thinner than something like strawberry or plum sorbet, and that's because lemon is mostly water, whereas plums and other more fruity fruits have a bit more texture to them. Right, back to now making ice cream. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to combine 160 grams of brown sugar with 30 grams of corn flour and 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to get a nice whisk and just whisk all this through nicely. And the point of this whisking is to make sure that our corn flour is mixed throughout the sugar, as opposed to clumps of corn flour and patches of sugar all over the place. And this limits the formation of lumps during our cooking process. To this dry mix, I then add about 350 milliliters of fresh milk, and then I whisk this again just to suspend the solids throughout the milk. And then I'm going to put that on the stove and let it come up to temperature at a very high heat. What we're trying to do here is bring it to a rapid boil, and once it's boiling, we're then going to whisk until our corn flour is cooked through, rehydrated, and the raw corn flour flavor is completely gone from our mix. While the base is cooking and before it's really boiled up, we're giving it an occasional stir. And also in the meantime, I'm going to combine 150 milliliters of fresh milk with 250 milliliters of fresh cream. I also want a bit of a fresh dairy flavor to my ice cream, and I don't want to overcook my cream. Once we have boiled our base for about 3 to 5 minutes, we'll remove it from the heat and immediately pour it through a strainer into our pre-prepared milk and cream. And then we'll whisk that thoroughly until all our hot bases dissolve throughout the fresh milk and cream. At this point, then I'm going to add again my hibiscus flowers here. I took about 12 different calyxes for my ice cream base, and this will make about 1 liter. So about 12 flowers per liter is plenty. Then I pour all the ice cream base on top of the hibiscus flowers in a separate container. And the point here is to totally submerge the hibiscus flowers in the liquid without stirring them throughout the liquid. And this is a really important step, because number one, acid plus heat plus stirring is equal to split dairy, right? So hibiscus is really acidic, and I learned this the hard way many years ago, the first time I tried to make hibiscus ice cream. The moment you stir it at temperature, you're gonna split your milk. And this is great if you're trying to make cheese, but if you're trying to make ice cream, minimize the stirring and just leave that alone to infuse over a few hours. Even overnight is fine in the fridge. The next day, the first thing you're gonna do is strain your entire base through a sieve. I'm also gonna push those hibiscus flowers to really express and really extract all that flavor out. The next step now is to mix everything together and then taste one last time before churning. I wanna make sure I'm happy with the level of sweetness. I wanna make sure I'm happy with the hibiscus flavor itself. Is it feeling fresh and floral enough for me, or do I need to do something else to it? Maybe wake it up with a little bit of some lemon juice. And adding lemon juice at a cold temperature, totally fine. It won't really split, but it will add heaps of flavor and correct for any overly sweet ice cream bases. And just like we did with the sorbet, now we come to the last churn of the day. So again, if you have an ice cream maker, if you've got an ice cream churner, feel free to use whatever the manufacturer recommends. If you don't, try and get some dry ice pellets. And again, dry ice straight into the ice cream base. That's already been pre-chilled in the fridge. And then you just churn that by hand, going slowly and making sure you're being thorough to the point where your ice cream is now almost too frozen, but just soft enough that you can scoop it into an ice cream container and then pop that into the freezer. Optionally, which is what I did for myself here, is just before I transferred the ice cream, I added sprinklings of citric acid. And what this allows is the introduction of a playfulness to the dish. As you are eating the ice cream, you get occasional pops of citric acid, and that's going to give you that little zing that sits in the back of your cheeks. Just hits of freshness throughout the ice cream experience, as opposed to one flavor note of hibiscus throughout the whole experience. I like to play with my food. I like to be reminded that I'm doing something joyful and playful. And once you get used to one note of flavor in any kind of food, your brain kind of switches off. You're now just consuming absent-mindedly. But this citric acid addition gives us pops of color, so visual intrigue, and pops of flavor. Imagine like a nice little lollipop that has a sherbet on the inside. Yeah, it's sweet and lovely on the outside. Then once in a while that sherbet seeps onto your tongue. You get a little fizz, a little bit of excitement. And yeah, all that's left now to do is scoop and serve it up and enjoy. From Soroi